Siblings escape. A severe orphanage and find refuge on a grandmother's farm where they discover a locked box that held an unimaginable secret. They were the grandmother's grandchildren. The Mercy home stood on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall walls and barred windows that shattered any hope of freedom. By day, the place resembled a silent, old-fashioned school, but at night, its dark corridors turned into a maze of shadows that unnerved its young residents. On that particular night, the dim corridor lights flickered while Lucia and Matthew, two inseparable siblings, stayed in their dorms with their hearts clenched. Lucia, the older sister, cared for Matthew as though she were his mother. Both had arrived at the orphanage after their parents' death, which left them at the mercy of director Amanda Montero. From the moment they set foot in the Mercy home, they endured strict rules and excessive punishments that kept them in a constant state of distress. Director Montero was a thin, elegant woman, always dressed in dark suits. She knew every corner of the orphanage and kept a firm grip on the children. Her only right-hand man was Mr. Michael, an assistant with a servile demeanor and an ambitious gaze, who obeyed her every order with unwavering diligence. Always keen on winning the director's favor, Michael never hesitated to snitch on anyone who dared break the rules. That week, the siblings noticed an unusual increase in security measures. Lucia perceived a tenser atmosphere, and Matthew seemed restless and nervous. During mealtimes, Director Montero watched them with heightened interest, as if waiting to catch them in some mischief. Deep down, Lucia sensed something unpleasant was brewing, but she had no idea how soon it would strike. By dusk, in the orphanage's large kitchen, the smell of cheap stews and stale bread filled the air. Matthew, with his stomach twisted by hunger, timidly approached the counter to ask for an extra serving. He knew it went against the rules, but he could not contain his need to eat just a bit more after so much deprivation. However, before he could even plead, the cook dismissed him with a brusque gesture. Hours later, as the night's cold seeped into their bones, a crash broke the silence of the building. Mr. Michael burst into the common room shouting Matthew's name, accusing him of stealing a piece of bread. The few lights still on cast a dim glow over the scene. Michael held the small piece of food up high, as though it were proof of a terrible crime. "He did it," Michael exclaimed, pointing an accusing finger at Matthew. "I found this bread hidden under his mattress." Stunned, Matthew shook his head in denial. He would never have been so reckless as to take something and leave it in plain sight on his bed. Yet Director Montero's piercing gaze fell upon him like an undeniable verdict. "I knew you were a troublesome child," she said with icy calm. "No one escapes justice here, understand?" Lucia's heart tightened at the sight of her brother crying in helplessness. She knew the truth. Matthew hadn't stolen anything, since they had been together all day. This was yet another setup by Michael to prove his loyalty to the director and paint Matthew as a delinquent. While all the other children were sent to their rooms, Lucia and Matthew were confined to a small cell in the basement, a grim space used as a punishment dungeon. The air smelled of dampness and fear, and the siblings felt panic crawling up their spines. "This has to end," Lucia whispered with a trembling voice, holding Matthew's hand. "We can't stay here any longer." Matthew tried to speak between sobs, but the words got caught in his throat. Lucia, though terrified, forced herself to look determined. She stepped closer to her brother, resolved to give him the strength he needed. "We have to escape," she murmured, clenching her fists. "No matter what it takes, I won't let them ruin our lives." At that moment, a gust of wind rattled the metal door of the basement, adding even more drama to the scene. Lucia knew they had reached a turning point. The cruelty of Matthew's accusation and their constant fear of future punishments pushed her toward a desperate plan. She decided she would do anything to protect her brother. Shadows in the basement cast ghostly shapes on the walls, like an omen that night would offer them no peace. Even so, Lucia lifted her gaze in determination. The seed of escape had taken root inside her, fed by injustice and the fear of becoming just another number under the director's watch. With every passing minute, Lucia's heartbeat grew stronger, and only one certainty remained in her mind. They had to flee that place as soon as possible. And thus, in the midst of darkness and terror, a spark of hope ignited in the siblings' eyes, promising that something drastic was about to happen. Time crept by in the Mercy home's dreary basement, where Lucia and Matthew sat slumped against the stone wall. The damp air chilled them to the bone, and although their stomachs rumbled with hunger, they could hardly think of anything but escaping that suffocating place. Lucia kept her gaze fixed on the locked door, plotting a way to outwit director Amanda Montero and her loyal assistant, Mr. Michael. Suddenly the door swung open and the siblings jumped to their feet, hearts pounding. One of the caretakers, Mrs. Fernandez, stepped in with orders to free them and lead them back to their rooms, but she warned them first that if they misbehaved, they would face an even harsher punishment. Lucia spotted her chance. As they climbed the stairs back up to the main hallway, she discreetly observed the keys on Mrs. Fernandez's worn key ring. She recognized the shape of the one that opened the side windows and etched that detail into her memory. That night, in their cramped bedroom, the siblings sat on the bed. Matthew still trembled from the memory of the unfair theft accusation, but Lucia looked at him with unwavering resolve. Without wasting a moment, she began figuring out the best way to get hold of the keys and open a way out. She also planned to gather some food for the journey, as they had no idea how far they would have to walk or where they would end up. "But what if they catch us?" Matthew whispered, his eyes filled with worry. "I don't want to be punished anymore." "They won't," Lucia replied firmly. "We'll leave tonight when everyone's asleep. I'll handle the keys and make sure we have supplies." During dinner, Lucia feigned obedience to avoid arousing suspicion. She watched Director Montero's and Mr. Michael's every move, waiting for the right moment. When a few children started leaving and Michael got distracted talking to the cook, Lucia slipped quietly into the small office next to the dining hall. There, in an old desk, she found a bunch of keys she quickly identified, the one for the side windows and another for the food pantry. She returned to the table just in time to help Matthew gather their meager belongings. Hiding the keys in an inside pocket of her jacket, she tried to move calmly, making sure no one noticed her intentions. Then, taking advantage of a moment when the staff was not looking, she snuck into the pantry. Under the cover of darkness, she managed to grab 2 loaves of bread, a bottle of water, and a few bruised fruits that could survive the trip. Back in their room, Lucia and Matthew carefully coordinated each step. They would wait until midnight, when silence weighed on the halls and the guards settled into their usual rounds. The plan was to slip quietly down to the ground floor, use the dim lighting to their advantage, and exit through a side window leading to a rear courtyard. That night, their pounding hearts sounded so loud they feared discovery by the mere noise of their own fear. But the urgency of fleeing drove them to move with caution. They made it down the stairs and hid in a corner upon hearing footsteps approach. A guard switched on a flashlight, briefly illuminating the hallway. The siblings held their breath while the beam of light swept back and forth. When the guard moved on, they continued. With trembling hands, Lucia tested one of the keys in the side window. The lock creaked, but finally gave way. Matthew's heart felt like it was about to burst from his chest, and Lucia barely dared to breathe. They quickly opened the window, exchanged a determined glance, and, first her, then him, slipped to the other side. The icy wind of early morning hit them with a biting force. Outside, the orphanage's walls seemed even taller, but Lucia had chosen carefully where the metal fence had a gap. They crawled across the wet grass until they reached that narrow opening, and despite a few scrapes and bruises, they managed to squeeze through to disappear into the darkness of the night. When they were several yards away, they looked back. The towering grey walls of the Mercy home faded into the shadows. For the first time in a long while, freedom was within their reach. Yet the adrenaline from their escape soon gave way to overwhelming exhaustion. They could barely walk, and they had no idea where to go. With minimal supplies, the fear of being pursued, and the uncertainty of which road to take, the siblings pressed on into the murky distance. The distant city lights were only a faint blur on the horizon, and Lucia and Matthew's strength began to wane. "Lucia," Matthew murmured, struggling to keep pace. "I can't go on." She bit her lip, her concern evident. Her entire plan had focused on getting out, but she hadn't truly considered what would come next. Now they were alone, in the middle of nowhere, enveloped by endless night. Cold and weary, they decided to keep walking in the hope of finding a safe haven. They still had no inkling of what awaited them beyond the orphanage's walls, but there was no turning back. With one final burst of courage, they continued putting distance between themselves and the Mercy home. The moon watched their wavering steps, a silent witness to their leap toward freedom. The early morning darkness seemed to swallow everything as Lucia and Matthew trudged along a rocky path, their muscles stiff with fatigue. The night air stung their faces, and with each step, they felt their energy slip away like a fading sigh. In the distance, they could make out the vague silhouettes of trees and fields, all shrouded in an unsettling blackness. They had been walking for hours since fleeing the Mercy home, hoping to find some place of safety. Their stomachs ached with hunger, and they had almost used up what little food they had managed to take from the orphanage. Determined to protect her younger brother, Lucia stayed alert, scanning her surroundings for any sign of life. It was then that Matthew, his voice nearly breaking from exhaustion, pointed off in the distance to a faint, flickering light. It seemed to come from a small, solitary house surrounded by a wide, darkened piece of land. Lucia gripped her brother's hand firmly, feeling a glimmer of hope pierce through the fog of her despair. With unsteady steps, they headed toward that light, following a barely defined path cutting through the tall grass. As they drew closer, they made out the silhouette of a modest farm, complete with a large barn and a neglected vegetable patch. Their fatigue mixed with the urgency of finding shelter, driving them onward, despite the fear that whoever lived there might turn them in. When they reached the front door, they found it locked. However, a dim glow in the window revealed that someone inside was still awake. Lucia took a deep breath and knocked softly, afraid to draw the attention of any potential pursuers. After a few tense moments, the door opened just a crack with a creak, revealing the deeply lined face of an elderly woman with dark eyes. "Who's there?" asked the woman in a serious, wary tone. Lucia, unable to hide the tremor in her voice, responded as firmly as she could manage. "Forgive us for disturbing you. We just need a place to stay for the night. We're alone and we're cold." The old woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Elizabeth, studied them with a mistrustful look. Her gaze swept over their dirty clothes and pale faces, trying to figure out if they posed any danger. Matthew's heart beat faster, fearing she would send them away at once. Yet something in Lucia's expression and in the little boy's frailty stirred a spark of compassion in Mrs. Elizabeth. "I can't leave you out there in this cold," she finally said, opening the door a bit wider. "Come in, but be sure not to make any noise." She led them inside the darkened house. The interior smelled faintly of toasted bread and burning wood from an old stove. With slow but steady steps, Mrs. Elizabeth brought them to the kitchen table, where she offered them some warm soup and a bit of water. Lucia and Matthew sat down, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, silently grateful for every sip that gave them back a thread of strength. "Where have you come from?" asked the elderly woman, frowning. Lucia hesitated to tell the whole truth. She didn't want to mention the orphanage for fear Mrs. Elizabeth might feel obligated to turn them in. Finally, she spoke of a place where they had been treated very badly, without naming names. Though Mrs. Elizabeth remained cautious, she sensed the children's sincerity and saw the signs of suffering etched in their eyes. "If you like," she said at last, "you can stay in the barn tonight. I have an old cot and some blankets that will help keep you warm." The siblings exchanged a look of relief. After wandering aimlessly, that offer felt like a miracle. Mrs. Elizabeth guided them to the barn just a few steps from the house. There, among stacks of straw and sacks of seed, was a small clearing. With a seemingly brusque manner, yet a genuine concern for their comfort, the old woman spread out a few blankets and settled the children in. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow," she remarked, her tone neither tender nor hostile. "For now, get some sleep. You need rest." Lucia and Matthew thanked her humbly. They lay down side by side on the makeshift bed, still chilled by the night air, but comforted by the knowledge that a door had opened for them at last. From the barn's threshold, Mrs. Elizabeth watched them a moment longer. Without a word, she quietly shut the door. Despite her exhaustion, Lucia found it hard to sleep. She spent a while holding Matthew and thinking about the kindness shown by that stranger. Her work-roughened hands and hunched back spoke of a hard life, yet the warmth of the offered soup reminded Lucia of the past, when her parents would cradle her by the home's hearth. Early the next morning, before the sun's rays were high in the sky, Mrs. Elizabeth returned. She pushed the barn door open gently and found the siblings sound asleep. For a brief moment, her usually serious features softened at the sight of those worn-out children, as vulnerable as wounded birds fallen into her yard. "Wake up! I've prepared something to eat," she announced in a calm voice, trying not to startle them. Lucia quickly stirred and shook Matthew awake. Morning light spilled through the barn's cracks, revealing the dark circles under both of their eyes. Even so, they got up and followed Mrs. Elizabeth to the kitchen, where fresh bread and a jar of warm milk awaited them on the table. Blushing slightly, Matthew summoned the courage to ask the old woman her name. She repeated it simply, and this time offered a faint smile. That small gesture of kindness was the first step in the conversation they all needed. Mrs. Elizabeth asked the children for their names, and noting their gratitude, allowed them to stay for a few days, while she decided what to do next. Though the children didn't notice, she wore a look of restrained concern. Preoccupied with the meal, Lucia and Matthew failed to see how Mrs. Elizabeth's gaze drifted off in distant reminiscence, recalling a time she perhaps wished to recover. There was a nostalgic, intense gleam in her eyes, betraying a hidden secret that troubled her as she looked at those two siblings so clearly starved for affection. Morning on the farm began with the distant crowing of roosters echoing among the pens and stirring Lucia and Matthew from their light sleep. They still felt the accumulated fatigue and uncertainty weighing on them, but that day, with sunlight illuminating the fields, a new hope began to sprout in their hearts. After a night's rest, more comfortable than any they had known at the orphanage, they roused themselves and, somewhat shyly, went looking for Mrs. Elizabeth to offer their help. The reserved old woman greeted them with a slight nod and motioned toward the barn where the cows and hay were kept. Thus, Lucia set about holding a bucket, while Mrs. Elizabeth milked her old cow, which she said had provided milk for years. Meanwhile, Matthew watched curiously, learning how to scatter grain for the chickens. Everything was new to them, but discovering the simplicity of that hands-on work made them feel useful and productive for the first time since escaping the Mercy home. Over the next few days, some of the stiffness the siblings had shown when they first arrived began to ease. Still, they moved cautiously, worried about displeasing Mrs. Elizabeth and getting thrown out. For her part, the old woman was rather curt, as if smiling cost her an effort, yet at times she looked at the children with a glimmer in her eyes, suggesting a fledgling affection. During those days, she prepared modest but hearty meals and let them sleep in a tiny guest room inside the house instead of the barn. With every sunset, the bond between the three grew more apparent. Mrs. Elizabeth showed them how to identify certain herbs in the garden and how to mend clothes, something Lucia was grateful for, since Matthew's jacket was badly torn. Although they spoke little of the past, there was a palpable sense that Mrs. Elizabeth kept something deeper hidden beyond simple charity. Whenever she saw the siblings cheerfully share their scant food, her eyes filled with a nostalgia she quickly masked with a cough or a brusque movement, returning her focus to her chores. One afternoon, with the sun painting the surrounding fields in golden tones, two people visited, the very ones the old woman introduced as Daniel and Maria. Daniel, a veterinarian, came to check on the livestock now and then. Maria, Mrs. Elizabeth's lifelong neighbor and friend, regularly brought fresh vegetables and shared coffee with her. Both visitors were taken aback to find the children cleaning the pen and tossing corn to the chickens. They exchanged questioning looks, for it was clear that these kids were not close relatives of the old woman, at least not that they could see. "Who are these hard-working children, Mrs. Elizabeth?" Maria asked, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide her curiosity. Mrs. Elizabeth only replied that they were two youngsters who had asked for shelter during hard times. Neither Lucia nor Matthew dared to offer more details, and Daniel, sensing the tension, steered the conversation elsewhere with a polite smile. Even so, Daniel and Maria were no fools. They could tell the children were hiding something. Although they didn't want to pry too much, concern showed plainly on their faces. Meanwhile, back at the Mercy Home, Director Amanda Montero had filed a report with the local police about Lucia and Matthew's disappearance, claiming the two were problematic minors who had run away for no reason. Furious at the possible scandal, she had Mr. Michael put up posters and offer a reward for any clue leading to the siblings' whereabouts. The director was determined to find them, fearing her reputation and the flow of donations might be damaged if word got out about the orphanage's terrible conditions. A pair of police officers began visiting local businesses and inquiring about two children on the run, but no one had concrete information. Some thought they might have seen two small figures walking late at night, though no one could be certain. Meanwhile, the ever-obsequious Mr. Michael plastered posters with Lucia and Matthew's photos all over the busiest parts of town, offering money for any information on their location. That same afternoon, Daniel and Maria were returning from the local shop when they passed a wall covered in flyers. They noticed two sheets of paper showing black and white photographs of Lucia and Matthew. Their hearts sank at once, recognizing the children's faces. They exchanged worried glances, aware they had just discovered the missing youngsters everyone was talking about. The printed image showed Lucia and Matthew from an earlier time, but their likenesses were unmistakable. With a serious expression, Daniel tore down one of the flyers and tucked it away, intending to discuss it with Mrs. Elizabeth. As they left, they saw more of those posters scattered across the area. The question now weighed on them: how long before someone else recognized the children? Life on the farm continued with relative calm for Lucia and Matthew, though an unspoken tension haunted their minds. They had settled into a small routine, helping Mrs. Elizabeth with farm chores, assisting her in the kitchen, and pitching in with any task that arose. Yet they knew their peace could be shattered at any moment if someone identified them, or if Director Montero and Mr. Michael got too close. Still, the old woman's house had become a cozy haven, one they found harder each day to think about leaving. A cloudy afternoon brought a sudden drop in temperature, and Mrs. Elizabeth sent Lucia to the attic to fetch blankets and coats stored away from the previous year. The attic, located on the house's second floor, was a long, low-ceilinged space with a couple of narrow, dust-covered windows. As Lucia climbed the creaking wooden steps, she felt each board protest beneath her feet, as if the old structure resented every step. The attic was dim, save for a ray of light shining through a crack in the window. Surrounded by old furniture and stacked boxes, Lucia searched for those labeled blankets. That was when, as she brushed aside cobwebs and moved a few items, she stumbled on an antique trunk. It stood out from the usual boxes, made of dark wood with metal fittings and a small rusty lock on the front. Curiosity drew her closer, and she leaned in to inspect the lock. It didn't look very strong, but it was secure enough not to yield to a simple tug. Lucia ran her hand over the dust-caked surface of the trunk, realizing someone had stowed it there with great care, someone who didn't want its contents within easy reach of prying eyes. She sensed something inside, perhaps documents or photographs, because the faint sound it made when she gently shook it was too subtle to be clothing or blankets. Though her instincts nudged her to investigate further, Lucia pulled back cautiously. She wasn't ready to force the lock. She didn't want to betray Mrs. Elizabeth's trust after everything the woman had done for them. Yet the presence of that mysterious trunk stirred an unease in her, mingling with the anxiety of being on the run. And yet she returned to the kitchen with the blankets she had managed to find, only to run into Matthew, who looked at her with concern. He'd been restless ever since Daniel and Maria's visit, and both siblings knew that posters bearing their faces still dotted the town. Anyone could turn them in for a reward. The thought kept him awake at night, terrified of returning to the orphanage and facing Director Montero's cruelty. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked softly, noticing the pensive expression on his sister's face. "Yes, don't worry," Lucia answered, forcing a smile. "I just found something odd in the attic, a locked trunk." Matthew raised his eyebrows, visibly intrigued. But he asked no further questions, since Mrs. Elizabeth was watching from the kitchen doorway. The old woman walked back and forth, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. Although she'd become more affectionate toward the children, Lucia and Matthew sensed a certain wariness in her, as though she were torn between protecting them at all costs and fulfilling some legal obligation. Deep down, Mrs. Elizabeth was torn apart. Every time she heard the siblings' timid laughter or saw them sharing bread at supper, her features softened briefly. But soon, a shadow of worry crossed her face, revealing her inner struggle. What if the police came knocking? Could she be accused of hiding 2 minors? What if the director filed a formal complaint? She couldn't bear the thought of Lucia and Matthew ending up in unscrupulous hands again, yet she also hesitated to challenge the law outright. Over time, Mrs. Elizabeth seemed to settle on a middle ground. She allowed the children to remain on the farm, sleep in the spare room, and enjoy a certain freedom around the property. However, she insisted they stay away from town and out of sight of strangers. Under no circumstances were they to go near the main road, where anyone might spot them and turn them in. Lucia understood the seriousness of their situation and complied with these rules, grateful for shelter and food. Matthew, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't be able to hide forever. Despite the apparent stability, it only took one glance at the old woman's eyes to see something was stirring inside her. Some evenings, when the setting sun glinted off the house windows, Mrs. Elizabeth would step onto the porch and gaze silently at the horizon, as though waiting for someone or something to untangle the knot of doubts in her heart. At such times, Lucia thought about the mysterious trunk in the attic, wondering if it contained secrets that might explain the warmth and sadness coexisting in that woman's soul. The afternoon when Daniel and Maria returned to check on the livestock, they brought news of the intensified search for the children and the poster campaign in town. Lucia shuddered upon hearing their comments, and Matthew clenched his fists nervously. Meanwhile, Mrs. Elizabeth remained silent, her jaw tight. She avoided meeting the siblings' eyes, though her mind swirled with questions about the danger they faced. Thus passed those strange weeks, entangled in both tranquility and dread, as they juggled the fear of being found and the deep attachment they were beginning to feel for the farm. Shortly before nightfall that day, the old woman climbed the attic stairs with an old lantern under the pretext of looking for an extra coat to ward off the growing cold. When her eyes fell upon the locked box, a glimmer of nostalgia flickered in them. She set the lantern on one of the beams and stood there motionless for a few moments, debating with herself. Finally, she sighed and laid trembling hands on the chest's lid, as though it contained a fragment of her own heart. She lowered her gaze with a burdened expression and turned to return downstairs, leaving the box where it was. But the intensity in her eyes as she left made it clear that this secret pained her, and that sooner or later she would have to face whatever lay sealed behind those old metal clasps. At the Mercy home, the corridors grew heavier with tension. After Director Amanda Montero reported Lucia and Matthew's disappearance, local authorities had begun investigating more thoroughly, though without conclusive results. That very afternoon, however, the director and her assistant, Mr. Michael, met in the main office to devise a more aggressive plan to track down the siblings and regain control of the situation. "We can't just stand around doing nothing, Michael," said Director Montero, frowning. "Every day that goes by is a risk, not only because of them, but for this place's reputation." "I'll do whatever it takes, Director," Michael responded, eager to please. "I'll step up patrols in the rural areas and hand out more posters to local businesses. With a high enough reward, someone's bound to talk." Thus, in the days that followed, pictures of Lucia and Matthew appeared on every post, every wall, and every bulletin board. The promise of a substantial sum of money for any solid lead drew the attention of neighbors and wanderers alike. Mr. Michael, with his servile smile, went door to door in the surrounding areas, questioning residents with relentless determination, always under Director Montero's approving gaze. Meanwhile, a new figure started roaming the orphanage corridors. Officer Gonzalez, a serious-looking policeman with a calm voice and a keen interest in the institution's inner workings. During his first inquiries, he immediately detected a certain unease among the caretakers and clear signs of fear in many of the children. When he questioned some of them, he received evasive, reluctant answers, evidence that they were keeping secrets out of fear of reprisal. One afternoon, Officer Gonzalez managed to speak privately with a teenager who was about to leave the orphanage upon turning 18. Whispering, the youth confessed that Lucia and Matthew were not the first to escape, but that no one dared speak of it. He mentioned the director's authoritarian behavior and how strange it was that the orphanage received so many donations without any improvement in the children's quality of life. Intrigued, Gonzalez grew more suspicious that Director Montero was hiding something far more serious than a mere pair of runaways. Meanwhile, life at Mrs. Elizabeth's farm proceeded under a calm that was nevertheless laden with anxiety. The siblings continued helping with daily tasks, taking care not to stray too far from the house or let themselves be seen by strangers. Even so, they clung to the hope that the increasingly warm-hearted old woman would find a legal way to keep them out of the Mercy home. However, their worries mounted with every visit from Daniel and Maria, who brought ever more discouraging news about the search. "They've plastered the town with posters of you two," Daniel said on one occasion, holding up a flyer in his hand. "They're offering more money now for any information. A lot of folks are talking, asking about any child who looks suspicious." "Maybe you should be more careful about hiding," Maria added somberly. "They're going door to door on nearby farms, and if they suspect anything, it won't be long before they come here." Mrs. Elizabeth was silent for a few seconds, watching the siblings. Both had their eyes on the floor, afraid she might decide to send them away to avoid trouble. But she pressed her lips together with resolve and declared that she wouldn't allow the director to get her way if the rumors about the orphanage turned out to be true. "They'll be safe here," Mrs. Elizabeth assured, without looking away, "but we must all be on our guard." Still, the tension lingered in the air. Lucia couldn't help imagining what might happen if they were discovered. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night with a start, terrified that Mr. Michael would creep in through the window to seize them by force. Matthew grew ever quieter, and both comforted each other when their anxiety threatened to overwhelm them. In the meantime, Officer Gonzalez was gathering evidence at the orphanage. His preliminary investigation pointed to possible abuse and questionable handling of donations, with large sums of money that never went toward improving the children's living conditions. This only fueled his doubts about the director's claim regarding Lucia and Matthew's supposedly dangerous behavior. With each new testimony, Gonzalez grew more convinced that something was amiss in Amanda Montero's management. One evening, while Mr. Michael was driving his car along one of the rural roads, he spotted a farmer mending a fence. Michael pulled over and got out, brandishing one of the posters as he offered a generous reward if the man recognized the children. The farmer said he hadn't seen them, but his hesitant answer and quivering voice raised Michael's suspicions. Though the farmer knew nothing about Lucia and Matthew, the assistant was convinced he was hiding some secret he refused to share. "Even the smallest clue could be key," Michael insisted, slipping the flyer into his pocket. "Don't hesitate to contact me if you change your mind." Baffled, the farmer watched him drive away without managing a reply. And so, with Michael's unyielding persistence and Director Montero's sharp watchfulness, the net around Lucia and Matthew tightened. Mrs. Elizabeth, Daniel, and Maria sensed it, so they took even greater care to keep the siblings safe. However, they all understood that sooner or later, danger would come knocking at the farm. As the sun sank behind the fields and Michael's car lights vanished in the distance, Mrs. Elizabeth's expression darkened while saying goodbye to Daniel and Maria at the front door. She sensed that this servile, ambitious man would stop at nothing to find them. Indeed, every step Mr. Michael took brought him closer to his target, like a predator on the trail of its prey. That afternoon faded at the farm under a soft light that tinged the clouds with pink and orange. Inside the house, Lucia and Matthew sat at the table, looking over some old recipes Mrs. Elizabeth had allowed them to use for dinner. Both felt a slight relief in knowing that, for the moment, no one had come barging onto the property in search of them. Still, the fear remained. They knew Director Amanda Montero and Mr. Michael would not give up easily. That afternoon, while Lucia was putting the recipes away in a kitchen drawer, Matthew ventured to look for thread and needle in Mrs. Elizabeth's sewing basket, intending to mend a small tear in his shirt. Between spools of thread and loose buttons, he noticed something metallic and shiny, a small key, seemingly hidden under a scrap of fabric. Intrigued, he picked it up and examined it closely, wondering what it might open. At that very moment, he remembered the mysterious trunk Lucia had found in the attic days earlier. Both had stifled their curiosity, afraid Mrs. Elizabeth might see it as a betrayal of her trust. Yet the discovery of that key stirred in him an almost irresistible urge to learn what the old woman was hiding. Moving with his usual caution, Matthew walked over to where Lucia stood and showed her what he had found. "Do you think it could be the trunk's key?" he whispered, making sure Mrs. Elizabeth couldn't hear them from the living room. Lucia tilted her head, studying the small key in surprise. She could almost feel her heartbeat quicken. She realized that forcing open the trunk might be prying into the old woman's personal life, but part of her believed that if they were to find a legitimate way to stay, they needed to understand what Mrs. Elizabeth was guarding so carefully. They waited patiently until the old woman went out to the garden, where she spent much of the afternoon tending her plants. Once certain she was occupied, they crept up the attic stairs with the stealth of two cats in the night. The place was as dark and dusty as before, piled with boxes and old furniture that groaned at the slightest touch. Lucia led Matthew to the corner where she had seen the box. It was there, covered by a faded cloth and surrounded by smaller trunks holding old belongings. Gently, they pulled off the cloth and tried the key on the lock. To their surprise, it clicked open with minimal effort, as though the lock had been waiting a long time for this moment. They exchanged a long, silent glance, wondering if it might be best to leave everything as it was. Yet curiosity won out. Lucia lifted the lid, revealing contents that took their breath away. The first thing they saw were several photographs of a young woman with a warm smile and eyes that resembled Lucia's. They recognized familiar features in that face. "That's Mom," Lucia murmured, her voice catching in her throat. Matthew, breath unsteady, picked up one of the photos for a closer look. It reminded him of fleeting childhood memories, those few recollections he had of his mother, who had passed away when he was still very small. Then he shifted his gaze to a bundle of old papers with official seals and signatures. Birth certificates bearing their names and a surname they both recognized instantly. Digging deeper, they found yellowed letters, written in neat, careful handwriting. Each page conveyed the desperation and love of someone who had tried to reach out to various offices and courts to regain custody of two children. Clearly, those children were Lucia and Matthew. Paragraph after paragraph repeated the name of Mrs. Elizabeth as the sender, the person who had fought ceaselessly for them. The siblings looked at each other in disbelief. The woman who had taken them in without hesitation was no kind-hearted stranger. She was their grandmother. Their hearts overflowed with a swirl of indescribable emotions: disbelief, joy, anger at the lost time, and a flicker of hope. They had grown up believing they had no remaining family, when in fact Mrs. Elizabeth had been there all along, waging a silent battle. So absorbed were they in this discovery that they scarcely heard the slow footsteps behind them. The attic door swung open, and Mrs. Elizabeth appeared, her face stricken. Upon seeing that they had opened the trunk, she went pale, but she made no move to scold them. She understood that sooner or later they would learn the truth. "So, now you know," she muttered, her voice trembling. At that instant, a wave of raw emotion washed over them all. Lucia rose with tears in her eyes and walked over to the old woman. Matthew stood still, clutching the papers to his chest. Mrs. Elizabeth, her own eyes brimming, confirmed what they had read. After her daughter's death, she had lost custody of her grandchildren because of falsified documents and suspicious donations linked to the orphanage. The letters in the trunk revealed everything. "I fought for you both for months," the old woman confessed, swallowing a sob that escaped her eyes' corners. "But the director, she had influence. Her lawyers claimed the children would be better off in that charity center. I couldn't do anything." Her words echoed in the hush of the attic. Lucia and Matthew felt a storm of emotions: fury at those who had separated them from their true family, relief at realizing they had not been abandoned, and hope that there might be a path other than returning to the orphanage. At last, Lucia wrapped her arms around the old woman and broke into sobs. Matthew joined the embrace, sensing that this moment marked a new reality for all three of them. For several minutes, they spoke no words, just the warmth of a family reunited after years of deceit. When they finally calmed, they exchanged determined looks. It was obvious they couldn't keep hiding forever, especially after discovering their real bond. For the first time, Lucia spoke up to suggest finding a lawful way to stand up for themselves, even if it meant challenging the director and uncovering the orphanage's murky dealings. Still teary-eyed, the old woman nodded slowly. She understood that eventually they would have to face the justice system, and that the only way to protect her grandchildren was to fight openly. Yet the danger remained. Those posters bearing Lucia and Matthew's faces still dotted the area, and the orphanage would not rest until it recaptured them. Thus ended that intense day, with the three clinging to the hope of a final resolution. Night fell, leaving the trunk open in the attic, its photos and letters spread out in plain sight, a symbol of the newly unveiled secret that would change their destinies forever. The words of Mrs. Elizabeth about her relationship to Lucia and Matthew echoed strongly through the atmosphere of the farm. It was an undeniable fact. The siblings had found their grandmother, and she was ready to do whatever it took to protect them. Still, they knew that family ties alone weren't enough to keep them safe. They would need to show that the children were receiving proper care and expose the abuses happening at the orphanage. Daniel and Maria were the first to offer their unconditional support. Upon learning the truth, they felt it was their duty to stand up for the siblings and for Mrs. Elizabeth. Together, the three of them devised a plan to gather evidence demonstrating the good treatment Lucia and Matthew received at the farm. They took photographs of the house, of the meals provided, and even wrote detailed statements about the tasks the children helped with: milking cows, collecting eggs, tending the garden, and assisting in minor repairs. "We'll prove that this is a real family environment," Maria explained, with conviction. "No one will be able to accuse Mrs. Elizabeth of neglect or mistreatment once we submit this evidence." Several neighbors in the area, moved by the story, offered their help, though some did so with reservations. They feared director Amanda Montero, known for her influence and high-level connections. Rumors spread throughout the town. Anyone daring to oppose her might face retaliation. As a result, more than a few people chose not to get openly involved, limiting themselves to sending provisions or quietly wishing them luck. Meanwhile, the director intensified her campaign to discredit Mrs. Elizabeth. As the search for Lucia and Matthew escalated, she repeatedly told authorities and the media that a woman of dubious reputation was holding 2 minors captive. To that end, she sent Mr. Michael to the nearby city, escorted by a police officer who owed her favors. Using questionable methods, this officer began pressuring witnesses and spreading rumors, aiming to tarnish Mrs. Elizabeth's reputation and depict her as an unstable woman refusing to obey the law. "We have to make sure this case doesn't stray into the orphanage abuse complaints," the director warned Michael. "Keep everyone focused on that woman's supposed irresponsibility. I want headlines and rumors painting her as a criminal." At the same time, Officer Gonzalez pressed on with his investigation inside the Mercy home. Each time he went through the orphanage's donation records, he found inconsistencies that didn't match expense reports. He noticed that the funds supposedly earmarked for the children's care did not align with the sparse food and threadbare clothing the orphans received. By interviewing former residents and some staff, he collected accounts of abusive behavior and excessive punishments. Everything pointed to the director possibly enriching herself through fraud. When Gonzalez confronted the director directly, she tried to ridicule him in front of other officers, claiming he was baselessly accusing her and insisting that the runaways were simply troublesome kids creating havoc. Nevertheless, Gonzalez stood firm. He had enough clues to suspect corruption and mistreatment, but he wanted formal proof before filing a more forceful complaint. Tensions rose daily. Mrs. Elizabeth became more cautious than ever, restricting Lucia and Matthew's outings and asking them not to go near the road or into shops. She relied on Daniel and Maria to get supplies and news from outside. The thought that Michael could appear at any moment kept her in a constant state of anxiety, though she refused to show it to the children. Just when it seemed the pressure couldn't intensify further, an unexpected encounter took place at the town market. Daniel had gone to buy seeds and, by bad luck, ran into Mr. Michael, who immediately recognized him as someone who frequently visited Mrs. Elizabeth's farm. The director's assistant approached with his forced smile and feigned politeness, holding one of the posters that showed Lucia and Matthew's pictures. "Haven't seen them around, have you?" he asked, tilting his head with apparent friendliness. "I've heard you know this area quite well." Daniel felt his heart race but tried to remain composed. He attempted to steer the conversation away, pointing out there were many children in the vicinity and that he couldn't be certain of anything. Michael, however, was shrewd. He picked up on the tension in Daniel's eyes and read between the lines of his evasive replies. A seed of suspicion became a tangible lead. "If you should see them," Michael added, emphasizing his words, "don't forget there's a hefty reward." Daniel just nodded without committing himself. As he left, he could feel Michael's eyes boring into him, memorizing every detail of his face and attire. That piercing stare haunted Daniel the rest of the day, filling him with unease. Back at the farm, Daniel recounted what had happened. Mrs. Elizabeth pressed her lips together, picturing Michael roaming the area, and Lucia and Matthew exchanged anxious glances. The net around them was tightening further, and they all realized that soon the moment of truth would arrive, forcing them to stand up for themselves or lose everything. Morning broke with a strange, heavy silence hanging over Mrs. Elizabeth's farm. Lucia and Matthew woke up uneasy, sensing something momentous was about to happen. Even the rooster's usual crowing sounded muffled, as if nature itself sensed the looming confrontation. While the old woman prepared breakfast, her hands trembled slightly, and Lucia noticed the worry in her eyes that she tried to hide. Daniel and Maria arrived early to share the latest news on the investigation. They knew Mr. Michael had been lurking around the area and feared he would soon appear, possibly accompanied by the local police. The tension in the house was palpable. Even so, Mrs. Elizabeth clung to the hope that Officer Gonzalez would expose the Mercy home's abuse before it was too late. Around mid-morning, the rough hum of engines announced the arrival of several vehicles at the farm's main gate. Lucia and Matthew peeked out the window, hearts pounding. They saw a black car and a truck carrying officers from elsewhere, people they'd never seen before. Among them, they could clearly distinguish Director Amanda Montero and Mr. Michael, followed by two stern-looking officers with rigid official gestures. "It's time, Matthew," Lucia whispered, feeling a lump in her throat. "We have to stick together." The front door shook under Michael's impatient pounding. The moment Mrs. Elizabeth opened it, Director Montero burst into the house, acting as though she owned the place. Without waiting for an invitation, she surveyed the home, searching for the siblings. The police officers trailed in behind her, and one of them wore handcuffs at his belt, a sight that made the children's hearts shrink. "I demand to see Lucia and Matthew right now," the director roared, fixing her cold gaze on Mrs. Elizabeth. "These officers have orders to return them to the Mercy Home." Mr. Michael, wearing his malicious grin, nodded and waved some documents at the old woman. "We have filed charges for kidnapping and document forgery," he announced arrogantly. "You cannot continue holding two minors illegally." The word kidnapping reverberated through the air like a hammer blow. From the hallway, Lucia clutched Matthew's hand tightly, and he trembled upon hearing such an accusation. Mrs. Elizabeth swallowed hard, struggling to remain composed. She knew the time had come to defend herself, and she could not afford to show weakness to those threatening to take her grandchildren. "I'm not kidnapping anyone," she replied, her voice shaky yet resolute. "Lucia and Matthew are my grandchildren, and if you accuse me of forgery, I have a way to prove you wrong." As the two siblings cautiously emerged from hiding and stood beside their grandmother, Daniel and Maria stepped forward to stand between the director and the children. The visiting officers watched with neutral expressions, apparently waiting to hear Mrs. Elizabeth's version of events before taking action. The old woman addressed one of them calmly, handing over a folder filled with papers. "Here are the real documents, their birth certificates, letters, and proof that I've been trying to regain custody of my grandchildren ever since my daughter passed away." Director Montero scowled as she saw the officer leaf through the folder. Mr. Michael grew visibly uneasy, as though sensing the situation might turn against him. It was then that Daniel and Maria added their own statements, describing in detail how the children arrived at the farm and highlighting the attentive care Mrs. Elizabeth provided. They spoke of the family atmosphere, the proper meals, the clean clothing, and the children's unwavering desire to stay with their grandmother. "They've never been here against their will," Maria affirmed, meeting the officer's eyes with determination. "On the contrary, they ran away from the orphanage because they were treated so badly." A murmur spread among the policemen, and one of the visiting officers consulted with his partner, reviewing the documents Mrs. Elizabeth had handed over. The old woman seized the moment to take a deep breath and display the dated, stamped letters, proving her multiple attempts to obtain legal custody of Lucia and Matthew. Everything looked too well ordered to be dismissed as simple forgery. At that precise instant, as though he had timed it perfectly, Officer Gonzalez appeared at the doorway. Lucia and Matthew's hearts skipped a beat, recognizing the man who had once spoken kindly to them. Looking solemn, Gonzalez asked to speak and presented his own folder to the visiting officers. "I'm Officer Gonzalez, and I've been investigating the Mercy Home for some time," he declared firmly. "I've gathered archived complaints against Director Montero for child abuse. Moreover, there is evidence that the institution's donations aren't being used for the charitable purposes they claim." Mr. Michael paled and took a step back, while the director kept her chin raised, feigning a composure that was beginning to falter. One of the officers skimmed through the documents Gonzalez handed over, frowning at the testimonies he read. "It seems the situation is more complex than we thought," he said, speaking to the other officers present. "We could be looking at a serious case of corruption. If that's confirmed, the minor's custody shouldn't be returned to the orphanage until there's a thorough investigation." The tension in the room instantly soared. Cornered, Director Montero launched accusations against Gonzalez and Mrs. Elizabeth, calling it all a scheme to ruin her reputation. But the visiting officers, now more cautious, seemed unwilling to make a hasty judgment. They examined the evidence uneasily, aware that they were dealing with a legal conflict that clearly warranted a larger-scale inquiry. Lucia and Matthew could barely contain the blend of fear and hope roiling within them. They watched Mrs. Elizabeth stand tall, clutching the papers that proved she was their grandmother, and Officer Gonzalez reveal the director's irregular dealings. Opposite them, Montero and Michael tried to uphold their story of a kidnapper grandmother. The scene hung in a thick silence. Which way would the scales of justice tip? Who would ultimately decide the legal custody of Lucia and Matthew? The glances exchanged between officers, witnesses, and the accused made it clear that nothing was settled. At any moment, a drastic decision could be made. Either the director and Michael would get their way, or the truth would finally emerge once and for all. Uncertainty lingered in the air, giving way to a decisive moment that would forever shape Lucia and Matthew's destiny. The tension that reigned at the farm during that pivotal confrontation swiftly triggered far-reaching consequences. After the accusations were aired and evidence presented, the out-of-town police realized the gravity of the situation. The icy composure of Director Amanda Montero began to crumble when Officer Gonzalez, bolstered by Mrs. Elizabeth's paperwork and Daniel and Maria's testimonies, called for a thorough investigation. Overwhelmed by the mounting proof, Mr. Michael, until then the director's loyal ally, started to show signs of growing nervousness. Cornered by the agent's questions, he lowered his gaze, breathing with difficulty. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he confessed to having tampered with the custody documents and falsified reports to prevent Mrs. Elizabeth from reclaiming her grandchildren. He also admitted that Director Montero orchestrated illegal schemes to divert the orphanage's donations, lining her own pockets without anyone daring to challenge her. "I couldn't refuse," Michael stammered, sweat dripping from his face. "She always knew how to keep me silent." A stunned hush settled over the room. Director Montero paled, furrowing her brow while shooting murderous looks at Michael, but it was too late to refute her assistant's words. The damage was done. With confirmation of those corrupt practices, the visiting officers notified their superiors. Authorities from the city acted quickly. They temporarily suspended the director from her duties and ordered the Mercy Home to close pending investigation. Word of the probe into embezzlement and child abuse spread through the town. Surprisingly, many neighbors who had been afraid before stepped forward to speak out, confirming Montero's abuse and the atmosphere of fear that had prevailed in the orphanage. While chaos rocked the institution, Mrs. Elizabeth and her grandchildren took a crucial step toward their own freedom. In the presence of a judge assigned to the case, the old woman submitted birth certificates, original letters, and reports by Daniel and Maria, all reinforced by Lucia and Matthew's testimony describing the ordeal they had lived through under the Mercy Home's care. During the hearing, not only was the family tie with Mrs. Elizabeth established, but also her capability to offer them a stable, loving environment. After several weeks of paperwork and appearances, the legal ruling favored them. Lucia and Matthew would officially remain in their grandmother's custody, with guarantees of protection and follow-up to ensure their well-being. Tears of joy filled their eyes as they hugged Mrs. Elizabeth on the courthouse steps, fully aware that their past of fear and oppression was finally behind them. Meanwhile, the Mercy Home came under more ethical management, appointed by the same authorities who had dismissed the director. The change was met with relief by the children still living there, many of whom had feared reprisals. The new administration promised sweeping reforms, transparency in handling donations, and respectful treatment of every child in residence. At the same time, the farm became Lucia and Matthew's permanent home. With their backpacks and few belongings, the siblings settled into the guest room that once felt like a temporary refuge, but now looked like the bedroom of two teenagers who could finally smile without worry. As for Mrs. Elizabeth, she rediscovered a happiness she had believed lost for years. Daniel and Maria remained involved throughout the process, standing by the family each step of the way, celebrating their legal victory and assisting them in their various chores. Inspired by everything that had happened, they joined Mrs. Elizabeth in renovating part of the land, aiming to support other children in vulnerable circumstances. Their goal was to create a safe space, a sort of temporary home, where kids could receive help until they reunited with their own families or found a better place to stay. Months went by, and the farm filled with children's voices and moments of camaraderie. With no fear of the orphanage's looming shadow, Lucia and Matthew enrolled in the local school and took part in the community with heads held high. The backyard turned into a vibrant vegetable garden where the grandmother and her grandchildren worked side by side to grow produce that nourished not only themselves, but also the children arriving in search of shelter. Late one autumn afternoon, as the wind softly brushed over golden fields, Mrs. Elizabeth watched Lucia and Matthew run alongside other children around a newly refurbished chicken coop. Her mind went back to those anguished days when a single paperwork error and a few people's greed nearly tore them apart forever. Now, that memory stood as a testament to their strength and love. They had overcome every obstacle, and nothing could rob them again of the peace they had found. Gaze brimming with hope, Mrs. Elizabeth felt proud to watch her grandchildren grow in freedom, aware of their rights and unburdened by fear. The farm was no longer just a hiding place. It had become the symbol of a new beginning for them all. And so ends this story filled with courage, hope, and the power of family. Thank you for joining us through every chapter and sharing in the emotions of Lucia, Matthew, and Mrs. Elizabeth. If you enjoyed this adventure, don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments. Your support inspires us to continue telling stories that remind us love and unity can overcome any obstacle. We'll see you soon with new tales and more surprises.